as Joe Rogan would say, and we're live.
Very nice.
Today I got Greg Hunt, or just Greg, or Groot, or the Viking, as you wish. Our
It's a lot of
CTO,
names, Jules.
our CTO of Motto, and I wanted to just grab him for a few minutes and talk about kind of like, the direction that we took with Motto a few years ago, going from like, a full service PHP agency, which would take on most work that's in the PHP realm, being in Magento or WordPress or, Drupal or Joomla or custom
Anything that came our
PHP,
way.
anything that came our way.
Yep.
And, why you were so adamant about changing direction and why you're so passionate about choosing one software specifically. Like what made you
Yeah.
bring that up?
Yeah. Well, because for sure we were doing well without having to change our direction. Like we could have just kept doing the LAMP stack, right? The Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. You can build out anything you want in that, right? And there was more than enough work to do that. But yeah, you're right. Like I did kind of bring up, why don't we get more specific to WordPress? There's a few reasons for that. One was just the demand. Like you got to listen to your market, right? So yeah, we were getting a lot of requests for a lot of different type of work, but at the same time, there was like a good chunk that was just like, hey, I have a WordPress site. Hey, like, can you help me with this? And also like, I actually looked into the trends. It's no secret that WordPress powers, I think now it's like 40% or some ridiculous number.
Right. So is
Back
that the
when we
trend?
started,
Is that the trend you're referring to? Is it just
yeah,
the amount of
that
volume one CMS carries in terms of like
totally,
the popularity? Okay. Did you take
totally.
anything else into account? Documentation, community,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
was it just,
There was a lot.
such as?
Um, yeah, well, just to finish my point there. So like back when we started, it was like what, 20% maybe. And so we saw it growing and growing. And at the same time, we needed to choose a CMS, right? Because
Why?
yeah,
Why
we could
did we need
we
to use a CMS? Why couldn't we just keep on trucking with uh, you know, Magento,
cost.
WordPress, Joomla?
Well, yeah, those are CMSs, right? So like we had, there was Joomla out there was Drupal out there was WordPress out there was Magento, there's all sorts of platforms, right? And so we needed to choose one to get the job done. And we tend to choose WordPress for simplicity's sake. Usually it was like easiest barrier to entry. It had more support, more plugins, more extensions, stuff like that that could just kind of get the job done. So that definitely played a factor as well. But then at the same time, like going back to the trends, it's like, well, we have all these platforms we can use, and most of them were tanking. And then there's WordPress that was shooting through the roof. So if we're going to bet on a platform, well, WordPress was it. And then that brings us to kind of the next point is like, we could learn everything under the sun. And yeah, we're PHP based, but there's a lot we can do in PHP. Or we can like listen to the demand. And if we choose a particular platform like WordPress, it makes a lot of other things easier. Number one on the production side, and number two on the marketing side.
So the
Probably a lot of
marketing,
people.
yeah, I mean, I get that, but on the production side, how does it make it easier if it's just PHP, all PHP?
Yeah. So training, for example, like if you have to train a developer in full stack web development from uh, databases to making an MVC framework and stuff like that in PHP, that's a lot more training than and stuff like documentation and training material you're gonna have to make yourself, as opposed to, well, we use WordPress, all the reading material and training documentations out there. It makes things more specific, and therefore easier to train developers on. Our stack is WordPress. It's a narrower stack than PHP itself, and a LAMP stack itself. and therefore there's less to learn. There's more specific things to learn, but it's more narrowed. We know it's easier to hire people. We put on our hiring the job boards, WordPress developer as opposed to web developer. If we're looking for a web developer, they could be all sorts of web developers out there that might not be specific to a certain ecosystem. And so we're going to have to train them on the particulars of what we're doing in our business. If we don't have, for example, like at one point we were doing SMBs, and I created our own kind of micro framework for us, right? To, spit out these sites rather quickly. But that also meant that we needed to maintain the software. We needed to write our own documentation on it. We needed to train people on it. All stuff we needed to do internally.
Right.
Whereas, well, all this stuff is done with WordPress. So why not just leverage the fact that it's already done?
So
And obviously we could have also chose other CMSs, but like I said, WordPress was the one that was really always taking off. So that's where all the demand was. So let's go in that direction.
so by choosing WordPress, you were standardizing development practices and training, not by doing it on your own, but also leveraging what's already there. So there's
Yeah.
less work for internal training guidelines or protocols.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was part of demand too, right? Because the reason why we're choosing CMSs was usually a cost question, right? Because we don't want to build up a CMS from the ground for a client that's very expensive. So, we had a certain mid-tier budget from clients where like, hey, we can't afford something very fine-tuned and made specifically for us, but we can afford a pre-built CMS,
So
right? So
what would be the downsides to that decision?
which decision?
To
To go
to
with
focus
WordPress.
on, yeah, what would be a obvious downsides for choosing WordPress in general?
Um, well, you narrow your tool set, right? Um, Quite often we still get customers coming for us, and they're even asking for WordPress, and we turn them down because we know it's not the right tool for the job. And yes, we could do it in-house, but it would take significant resources and like more expertise to like get it done because most of our staff is only working in WordPress now, right?
Mhm.
So it kind of you pigeonhole yourself, and you do technically have less of a market to satisfy, but at the same time, the WordPress market is so enormous. For every customer we turn away because WordPress isn't the appropriate tool, there's 10 others that want it, and it is the appropriate tool.
Okay.
So it didn't really, I'm kind of copying out on the question. It's like a downside, but at the same time, it's not because
Right.
we're able to still get those type of clients. But
Right.
it's not the best tool for every job. That's definitely it. And I have my own opinions on WordPress in terms of the platform in and of itself. Like we make a living off of it. It's great, and I really appreciate it for what it is. But if I'm making sites for myself or stuff like that, like that's not usually the thing I choose. You know, it's a little bloated and antiquated, and it's hard to get some specific things done a lot of times. So there's security issues that you can get around, but they're needlessly there. So
And
yeah,
how about the dev experience of developing in WordPress?
it's not good.
Why?
It's not good. It's
Why
not
is it
good.
not good?
The user experience can be pretty good, and that's why like people chose it historically because it was one of the few CMSs right out of the gate that actually everyone kind of enjoyed the administration panel. That's why it was chosen. It was generic enough to fit most people's content models and needs into it, and it was just a pretty clean interface, and that's why people liked it. So for the user experience, it was good. For the dev experience, no, it's uh, just the templating. Just as a developer, if you're making websites, you're going to need some sort of templating language to create your views and stuff like that. And WordPress was just straight PHP,
Right.
right? You just include stuff in it, which is fine, but there's much better ways of doing it these days.
It's more like handling,
Um,
like scripting more than like object oriented or MVC.
yeah, well, there's a lot of repetition. You can get around it. It's just like you can make a layout file and then inject your page into the middle of it, and then so you don't have to include a header and footer on every single uh, page template in WordPress. That's just one thing, right? If you're always going to include a header and footer on each page has a certain layout, but it's like needlessly repetitive. Whereas you can just have one layout file. That's something you would be default in a good templating engine.
Right. So
And just like it has this weird hierarchy of like it's the major thing with WordPress is it doesn't have a very consistent like paradigm to it. Like it's not totally MVC, but it's a little bit. It's not totally event driven, but it's a little bit. You know, it's not. It doesn't really have like a um, routes that map to specific templates, but it does at the same time. It's just you just kind of have to know how it works in terms of like, oh well, this is an archive, and this is this, and this is that. So it's pretty hard to navigate. It's not. Yeah, it's a little messy,
right. So
especially when you
so
start working in other frameworks, more modern ones. You'll see
so
the difference.
if I had to recap of like, why you decided to choose WordPress, just let's just say not on the marketing angle, that we'll go into that in just a second, but just on more on like the production related reasons why you would. One would be for lower barrier of entry for training,
Yeah, and more specific.
and more specific, already a viable documentation that's out there
Yeah,
and publicly that's easily accessible,
and
um,
ecosystem.
an ecosystem, a community, which is huge. And we'll touch upon that when we talk about like the marketing advantages of focusing on WordPress. But also it was knowing that like this framework that we will use will be limited. So we'll have to say no to some projects because as soon as you say yes to them, we'll have to then,
Mhm.
not use WordPress and use either another type of CMS or just a general programming framework.
Totally, yeah. And just to expand on that, it is kind of also a blessing in disguise too, because that meant we had a more focused uh, demographic of client, right? Because the
Right.
people that use WordPress are more likely to be mid-tier than enterprise level, or
Right.
even like super. I mean, there is that super beginner startup type of demographic too, which we tend to stay away from
Right.
that do use WordPress, but that could be filtered out, and then you're left with that mid tier, which is something we knew we didn't want to service outside of. We didn't want to do the enterprise or the big e-com shops and stuff like that because they came with all the other
Correct.
um, things that come along with being a big agency. Having a SEO department, having a marketing
Right.
department, having a design department. It's
Right.
like we're developers,
Right.
and we're full stack developers, right? So we just wanted
Right.
to you have what you want at the end of the tunnel in terms of a design, and we get it done for you, and you have your admin.
Right. And I think another thing I'd add
And
to like one of the benefits of like choosing, um, one CMS, not specifically WordPress, but one CMS is that you yourself, the agency and the team becomes more familiar with it over time as you're just putting
yeah,
hours into it. So when a customer
we can help each
calls,
other out.
not only ourselves, but like our customers, and I've noticed that most of our customers, they do contact us regularly for just general support on how WordPress works, how their website works, how to edit certain things. And that,
Mhm.
it's kind of lacking in the WordPress sphere for a generic user. So a lot of this documentation that's out there is really designed for like developers and people looking to maintain WordPress sites, build out WordPress websites. But most standard, and those people that have access to that are people who are kind of, like Google search experts. Like, you and I have been trained in how to search on Google for
That's your
just
primary job as a developer, as you're a good
a
Googler.
exactly. But if you're a marketing director or you're in charge of, marketing of your website and it's on WordPress, it might not be as easy for them, or they don't have the experience in that. So getting information for them, it can be quite difficult. And you can't just call WordPress. You can't just call them and say, I
Right.
got a question. This one page is working really slowly and I don't know why.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
and I feel like that's really been a big reason why we've certain like set ourselves apart is because we can answer those questions for the customers.
Yeah. No,
And
you hit it. You hit it on the head there. I think symptomatic of that is that there's actually too much information and resources in the space, and it becomes very disorienting
Right.
to customers. And so for us to be there to them for them to like orient them and be like, hey, we know there's a million options, but actually only 20% of them are legitimate, and this is what you should look at. Like that's set us apart, definitely. And like you
So
said,
yeah, so getting back to the original like question is like why did you choose WordPress? Now let's say let's level off the playing field here. Let's go back in time 3 years ago, and the market share of CMSs were all split. Which one would you have chosen? So community documentation, all that is fair game. There's no advantage there, but
well, sorry, did something
the advantage just hypothetically we're in
what's
a
the difference
scenario.
between when it used to what's the difference? Because we were in that situation, I chose WordPress. So what
Well, WordPress
scenario are
was
you
still
painting?
20%, and the second place CMS was like 2%. So it was still by far in the lead, right? And you
Uh-huh.
saw growth in that specific
Yeah.
one, right? But let's say those metrics that you used were all balanced out across
Oh,
the
okay.
board. It worked out.
Okay, I see.
So no matter which one you chose, for the marketing aspect, you're covered. For the dev side, you're covered. Um, which one would have been the one you chose? Would it have been a Shopify? Would it have been a Magento? Would it have been a Drupal, a Joomla? Uh, which one would it have been?
It's good. It's a good question. I think I'm going to put aside the e-commerce frameworks
Sure, sure.
because that
Different
was
game.
part of the, yeah, it's a whole different route. And like I said, e-commerce, high level retail, all that, it's different kind of agency that
Yep.
I wasn't as interested in. Um,
There's a lot of marketing behind
so
that.
yeah, exactly. And I did my fair share of marketing and SEO back in the day, but I didn't want to specialize in that. I like the code, so
Agreed.
um yeah, just in terms of like the more generic CMSs, uh Drupal was interesting. I've always had like a little bit of a pulse on there.
I've
Um
heard it's very dev friendly. Their environment, their framework.
yeah, I think they use a lot more like proper packaging, and I think they use a lot of like Symfony components as well,
I was
which
about to ask,
uh
wasn't it based off a PHP framework? Drupal.
yeah, but I think it evolved
Oh, okay.
past it. It might have been forked from an older one.
I see.
I forget
Okay.
which one. I think you're right, but I forget which one exactly. Um, yeah, I think it was just forked and then took off its own at one point. Um, yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, like, also I was more familiar with WordPress,
Okay. So a little biasness there, but
so there was definitely this like a built-in bias. Exactly, like I just knew more. So if you want to get the job done, you use the tool you know best.
that's fair. That's
You
fair.
know.
But try to think back of like, you're a CTO and you have to
Hmm.
make the decision and you have zero experience in any of them, but all the metrics line up the same no matter what CMS you were going to choose. So the only outlier would be as a CTO, unbiasedly, you got to kind of grade the framework for your devs and which one is I guess a better dev environment to play with.
So which okay. So let me reframe the question and make sure I understand. So out of the CMSs at that time,
Hmm.
which one was just a better quality and developer experience to work
Yeah,
with?
exactly.
Really testing my memory. Um, um, I don't think I can really give a fair answer to that, just because I didn't have enough experience actually working in a production environment with the other ones. Like I said, all the
Hmm.
production work I did was pretty much on WordPress, and so to the extent that I was familiar with the other CMSs, I was playing around with them. I was
Okay.
experimenting with them,
Okay.
and so I don't really have too much real world um, experience with it, so it's hard to say. Drupal did have a higher barrier to entry as a developer, but it's an interesting thing to think about as well because sometimes you want that higher barrier to entry. We have a problem in the WordPress industry that it's too low. And so the developers we get that know WordPress, a lot of times it's just literally, oh wow, yeah, okay, you installed a template. You're a WordPress developer. That's not what we're looking for. You know what I mean? So there's like way too many amateurs. Whereas Drupal, it's like, no, you have to like be a developer to really wield it, right? And so that would have filtered out our hiring to actually have like more capable developers, but probably fewer. Um, so that's one thing I can say on that.
Okay. So it's
Joomla was close. Joomla was closer to WordPress in that regard.
yeah.
It's like kind of in between Drupal and WordPress on that spectrum of flexibility and developer, you know, um, experience and stuff like that.
Okay. But it's fair
Yeah.
to say that WordPress wouldn't have been first,
Um,
strictly for the environment
Strictly for
framework.
developer
Yes.
experience
Yeah, developer experience.
at that time. No, I guess not, but it wouldn't have been a big gap.
Okay.
It'd be marginal difference. All of them, none of them were really all that friendly. Um, and to be honest, I forget at what state Drupal was at that point in time for WordPress. You know how developer friendly it actually was.
Right.
Was it using a package manager? Was it using a good templating engine? I forget if they're using Twig or something. If that's the case, that would have been better, but I can't really recall if that was the case.
Right. Okay.
Um, yeah, but I think it was a marginal difference. Back then, there was a lot less of a focus on developer experience than there is now. Back
Okay.
then, is figure out your tool and make it work, guys.
So we are talking about like maybe 3 years, or let's give it 4 years because of pandemic
Well, I'm
timing
talking
too.
like 6 or 7 now. I'm talking back on Saint Ambroise.
Right, but your decision was like 4 years ago for like motto specifically to like change direction or like to
Yeah, yeah,
zero in.
but
So you're saying the
right, okay,
last
but
4 years there's been a dramatic difference in WordPress?
well, let me just clarify. So I'm talking when you're asking me this question, I'm talking about before 4 years ago, because at 4 years ago we had already had significant momentum in WordPress, right? So
Yeah.
we already had a lot of WordPress projects, and so that was like the major decision
Okay.
point. Like, well, if we're already 80% WordPress and we see it getting bigger, we're obviously going to stick with that,
Right.
right?
Right.
So,
Um,
yeah,
going on to the advantages of like the marketing side of things, biz dev side of things, that's been very enlightening, especially for me.
mm,
It's like where, you know, um, you're you're offering a service and or product in a space where people are constantly looking for your service and product. And it's nice to know that like, there's the demand for this. And I think it's really important to think about that when you have a business is that like, are you getting yourself into something that, you have to shove down people's throat to get far, or are people gonna be knocking on your door because they're knocking on 6 doors that week to find out who they're going to use because they're definitely going to use somebody, you know,
people are
and
already sold on WordPress before they come to
exactly,
us. We're just
exactly.
fulfilling the demand.
Right. And I've noticed that like, as you engage with the community, and you become someone within the community, and there's many ways of doing that. Well, we can touch upon that in a different convo, but just in general, that if you are, putting yourself out there in that space, you will get business if you're good. Like you will get business. And that's
And
the interesting
yeah,
part. So like, that's also helped our cost of acquisition. It's significantly lower than traditional businesses businesses that completely rely on going out to our customers because people are
yeah,
looking for our services. It's a in demand service and product.
it's it's a very it's a really special place in terms of like an inflection point of demand versus niche, right? Anybody that's ever done PPC knows that the more niche your keyword, the more specific your keyword, the less you pay because there's less competition for it. And
Right.
so the magical as a good whatever marketer or something, somebody doing online advertising, like you want to find that magical inflection point where there's a lot there's a lot of demand but not a lot of
Right.
competition. And so and then less competition inherently means you're in a specific
Right.
niche. And so that niche effect of WordPress being like, and especially, there's a niche effect in terms of like, well, we only do WordPress, and so there's less people, there's more people out there doing web dev than there is specifically WordPress. At least used to be.
Right.
But and so, but at the same time, there was just so much demand for it. Everyone's just on WordPress. So it wasn't the case where you got into a niche and then there was a lot less people. So yeah, you got all those clients, but there just wasn't a big pool of people. No, there was still a huge pool.
Mm-hmm.
And then number two, a niche, not just in terms of when we get into a niche, it's not just in terms of less competition, but in terms of you automatically become more of an expert. Because if it's the only thing you do, you got to be good at it, right? If you only sell a good bowl of pho, right? That's the only thing you have on your menu,
Right.
and you go and buy that bowl. You're the place that sells pho, so you're gonna be the best in town, or people are gonna assume you're the best in town because you're not a Chinese restaurant with a million things on its menu where maybe it's good, maybe it's not, but you're not specializing. So
Correct.
you're a jack of all trades.
Right.
And before we made the switch to WordPress, there's a lot of agencies out there and other freelancers we were working with and stuff like that were, including ourselves, that we tried out for a while, where it was like, okay, we're a jack of all trades. We didn't say no to anything.
Right.
You had money, we had a decent set of skills to actually fulfill
Right.
it. We'll take it. But then we never became known for anything.
Right.
Right.
And it's also hard to
that's the
rinse
niche
and
effect.
repeat. If everything's new coming in the door, you can't rinse and repeat. You just can't. Everything's
What do you mean
based.
by that exactly?
Well, for example, let's say one customer comes in and says, "I need a Magento site," and we say yes. And the other
Yeah.
day, someone comes in a Joomla site, and if you are always relying 100% of your team just trying to decipher code, reverse engineer code in a framework they're not familiar with because it's their second Joomla project, third Joomla project, it's like, well, you're better off giving a developer a WordPress a project that whatever the details of that project is, they've already done 30 times, 100 times,
Yeah, exactly.
500 times, because
Exactly.
the
They become the
10,000 hours methodology of becoming an expert in something. That's how you do it. But you can't you can't be an expert something without repetition. It's just impossible. It's like
exactly
Bruce Lee's like, I don't fear the man who practices how to punch and kick. He's like, he fears the man who practices a jab 1,000 times. Like,
right.
That's the man to fear, because like he knows how to jab when he's going to use it. So it's like in this scenario, it's like, well, I'd rather give my business to someone, and I'm seeing that more and more, where potential customers that come in, and when I tell them like we only do WordPress, I think it's kind of
they
like,
see us as an expert right away.
Yeah, because they can relate that to anything else they've done in their career or their businesses, where it's like, well, and I think that's just holistically in business world, kind of like, a pretty, like a pretty known fundamental that like the more spread out you are, the less good you're going to be. It's just the way it is.
Totally.
So
That's very interesting. Yeah, because it's doing one thing makes the market see you as an expert, and then it fulfills itself because you only do that one thing. Like you say, you do become the expert because that's the only thing you're doing. So it fulfills itself, and it's a really magical place to be in. But that only works if there's the demand there for it. If you put yourself in a niche to, like, I don't know, just like something way too specific.
Right.
Like, yeah, you can service the 5 people for that, but you're not going to make a living off of it.
Yeah, I remember back in the day we had a customer and they did like high-end renovation projects on mansions in Montreal and all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting, like, because the contractor that was my main contact, he was a team lead and contractor for his customers, and he has no staff. one of the biggest renovation companies in the city, and they have no staff. They're like, we just sourced out the best people, what they do, and we hired them. And it's a premium, but our customers are willing to pay the premium. So we have a job, and I know I need a bricklayer. I need someone who knows how to put up joints,
Hmm.
because he's like, I'm not using the same guy to put up the joints to paint.
Hmm.
And he even said, he's like, I want the guy who's painting my customer's house, the guy who's only painted for 30 years.
Funny enough, that was our niche too, right? Because when WordPress, there's a lot of people doing very subpar jobs, and
Right.
a lot of customers know that. And so we actually position ourselves as, yeah, we know there's a lot of crappy work out there cutting corners, but we are at the heart of it professional developers, even though we're using WordPress.
Right.
And people resonated with that really quickly. And so we were then premium WordPress developers.
Yeah.
That was a key part of the niche. We weren't just WordPress developers where we set you up a template. No,
Right.
you have a bespoke premium experience with a proper agency that would service you and take it seriously.
Right. So I think that's like a something to take away. Is that like the more niche you can be and the more focused you can be in one specific service, or in our case,
Magical.
in the web agency field, if you can really piggyback off a framework and become an expert in it, it doesn't even matter which one it is. There's so many big players out there, and they're not as big as WordPress, but like Shopify has like an online
Mhm.
university. You take courses, and you can slowly become a professional in it. You can say, hey, I'm a Shopify expert. And
Yeah,
we always get requests for Shopify work. We always do. Like
yeah,
once a quarter, or at least we get one or two a month, and we say
yeah.
no to it. But that's another example of like how you can choose something and just focus on it and go with it.
Well, yeah, you technically you lower your marketing budget because you no longer have to sell people.
The
You
why.
don't you no longer yeah, you don't have to sell people on what you do. The platform has already sold them.
Right.
Now they just need somebody to fulfill it, you know?
Right.
Um, I was recommending to my dad the other day, he wanted to get into web development, and you could go and learn to code or whatever, but then it's like you do need to, like, how are you going to market yourself? Well, there's tons of do it yourself platforms out there, right? And they've done all the marketing, Wix, Squarespace. People know of these places, and they have a marketplace, and they have people already signed up, but they still do need people to, or just professionals to like help out these people and set up the sites and whatever. If you're a business person, you're busy. You can't do everything yourself, even if you can, even if you're capable, right? So I told them, like, well, piggyback off these big names that need work done, but then they've already spent all the budget to make sure people know of the platform.
Right.
And that was the effect we had from WordPress. Like I think at one point we actually had this discussion early on where it's like, okay, we're gonna double down on WordPress, but like, you know, will people know WordPress? Like I was really pushing to like, no, in our marketing messaging, we are WordPress people. And I think it was still kind of undecided. It's like, yeah, but like if we do that, like the layman person that's using, they don't even know what they're using on their site. If you're a business, they don't know
Right.
if they're using WordPress or not. They just know they have a website. And so if we message it, oh, we're using WordPress, they won't actually know. But luckily, it was not the case. Because our demographic was maybe a little bit more professional, we had marketing directors and stuff like that that were
Right.
dealing with it, and they were familiar with the platform they're on, and
Right.
so they knew the word WordPress. They knew that's what they were using, and so we were
I
able to use that as a piggybacked word
Right,
marketing
and
term.
and that definitely, as you said, like decrease our cost of like marketing, cost of acquisition dramatically. Like you
You don't
can't.
have to sell people. Yeah.
Correct, which is an interesting, valid point. And like I think, as you know, like we're pretty much in the service space of WordPress right now in the WordPress industry. We're trying to go into product, but right now in the service space, like you also, I find in this space, lower your competition, because you can start saying that like we're not a web development agency. We are a WordPress agency. So if someone comes to me for a quote, I'm like, well, I got a quote from this guy, and I look at his website, he goes, we're a web agency. We do digital marketing, we do websites, and yet I'm not going to consider it a competition. That goes back to like 10,000 hours. Are you comparing me to someone else that has 10,000
Hmm.
hours? And if you're not, then you're barking up the wrong tree, type of thing coming to us. Um,
Totally.
but the one thing I wanted to touch upon was you were mentioning how we have like a software approach to maintaining, developing, WordPress. Where the devs that work on our WordPress websites, and obviously including yourself, are from like a software background, let's say, in the sense of like, you can easily code out a web app using
Yeah.
a framework of your choice. Knowing you like your
They were
Laravel,
capable outside of
your
WordPress. Yeah.
yeah, your React, but also it's not just what your coding skills are. It's more of like that mentality that you bring to the table, whereas opposed to it's very different from someone who picked up WordPress that wasn't a developer, and they just rely on like the ability to plug and play, find a plugin, connect it, look up ways to customize the code a bit because it's lacking a little bit here and there, but
Hmm.
but there's no versioning behind their websites. There's no regular backups in place. There's no um,
Optimization, performance.
there's no consideration into that. Maybe don't even know about Google Lighthouse. Like it's just plug and play. It's online. It works. I'm done. I'm a developer, which
They don't
obviously
even know. Yeah.
is obviously not the case, right? So
Hmm.
if you had to tell all the young folks listening, how to take a software approach to like developing a WordPress theme, and not the whys, but actually like
The
what
proper
what
way.
just in general, like talk about a little bit about like versioning DevOps a bit, and then like go on to the next step would be like, okay, you have WordPress, but I know that we would use Sage on some projects, and we would use Generate Press on other projects, and obviously now we're completely switching to like block editing and Gutenberg, but
Hmm.
that's another conversation because it's still new. But like right now we do use Sage and Generate Press. So why Sage, and why would you choose Sage?
Um, that depends what level you're at, right? So if I'm talking to somebody that's just getting into WordPress but wants to do it the proper way, wants to become a proper developer,
Let's
like
say they're a proper developer and then just
okay,
decide to pick up WordPress, so they
okay,
know
so they're
all.
already a developer and they want to
Yes.
see what are okay. Yeah, I mean it does depend on the size of the project. It does depend on the size of the project, how much
Mm,
features are going to go out, the client demands. I'm not trying to cop out of the question, but it is very context specific. And even in our business, we do choose different stacks depending on the client, right? For
right. So,
example,
so let's get back to the Sage. I think Sage is, unless I'm mistaken, is a little bit more on the dev oriented side than it would be Generate Press.
yeah, so yeah, Sage brings a lot more like modern practices into play. Um,
What makes
for
it
those
dev
that,
friendly? Why is it dev friendly?
well, number one, you can use technologies like SaaS, right? So um, it has more baked in tooling, so to speak, right? So usually this has gotten out of control in the JavaScript ecosystem, but usually when you're writing code, adding tooling to your coding experience will help the developer experience, right? So um, for those of you who know what SAS is, it's a pre-compiled version of CSS where it has kind of extended features that you can use that wouldn't work directly in a browser, but you can compile it to plain CSS. So when you are writing it, it's a lot easier to write. It's a lot more concise. You're repeating yourself less. You literally need to write a lot less code, less keystrokes, better developer experience. You get things done faster. It's easier to maintain.
Sage
A
allows you to do.
lot of it, yeah, a lot of it really just comes down to it. It gives you the tools to uh, to put in place proper developer um, paradigms like not repeating yourself, right? Or single responsibility principle or other things of that nature, which are like all good things you should know as a developer, but are kind of hard to implement in WordPress right out of the box because it doesn't have um, the infrastructure to do it properly, right?
So When you think about some of our last projects that were on Sage and give an example of like, something, a feature, a function that you build off in Sage using the Sage framework that
Hmm.
A wouldn't have been possible or would have been a lot more difficult just using native WordPress theming methods.
Yeah, so one of our last projects, we for a while now, I've been pushing everyone in the company, including myself, just do more and more things on a component level. Um, Whereas WordPress, by its nature, is very much a page level thing, right? You have a template that just renders a page, a route. Um, Whereas, like when you're talking about a modern website and a bigger website at that, it's not page based. There's a lot of components involved, and you want to have to for a large site. You want to make a million different pages. You want to make a couple dozen components that compose all of those pages. That way, you write a lot less code. You again repeat yourself less because now you're just composing pages with things that have been pre-built. So you're able to abstract a lot more. And so with Sage, it's using Blade as a templating language, which is great.
Why is it great?
And it well, number one, it's great just because it is a templating language as opposed to WordPress not really being that. It's just straight PHP. Although PHP was built as a templating programming language, it's kind of antiquated in terms of its features. So just using a templating language is good. It'll give you some a lot better developer experience. And then secondly, you can run PHP directly in it, so you can always you don't have to know all the ins and out of Blade. You can just kind of default to writing plain PHP, right? So it's like backwards compatible, so to speak. It's just like CSS. It's like SAS and CSS. Well, you don't have to know every little feature of SAS because you can just jump into it and write straight CSS, right? And so the learning curve is less and stuff like that. But yeah, so the templating language and it is a very Blade over the years has become more and more component based in terms of like it has a lot of nice little features to write components that can be passed around easily. The data between them gets passed around like a lot more easily. There's a better data flow between things. It's not route and then all the data gets passed to all the page. It's like no, you can pass around specific data to specific components. So you're not thinking on a page level anymore. You're thinking on a small component level. And conceptually, it's a lot easier to deal with smaller components, right? It's hard to hold 20 things in your head and try to make sure they all fit together. We technically can only do about 5 in our short-term memory. So if you can narrow this focus of what you're looking at and developing, you're going to make whatever that is. It's going to be built better, more efficiently, and be easier to focus on and make it more flexible. And then with a bunch of components like those, then you just assemble it into like a really well working site. So I think the whole component based architecture was like a big revelation over the years because it used to be called a web page for a reason, right? It's a page. And so that's how we conceptualized development for a long time. But over the years, we realized, okay, no, a page is actually a collection of components. And on all these pages, we're reusing a lot of the same things. There's a header on every single page that is exactly the same. There's a menu that is exactly the same. There are buttons that are exactly the same, so why not that be the building block? Let's zoom in a little bit. And when you zoom in, back to our conversation before, it's easier to deal with things in the specifics in a smaller scope. You're making a niche out of the thing you're building, so you can do it better.
So Sage makes it more feasible to develop in components.
Yes, definitely, in a lot of different ways. A lot of different ways, and you have a package manager, you have Composer built into it, so you can like pull in some already made packages and tools in PHP and manage that properly.
So that's the dev
You can
tools
extend it more.
before.
Yeah.
Cool.
Package
Okay.
managers are huge. Like every language has them for a reason. WordPress, its package manager is plugins,
Right.
really. It's a kind of
Right.
its form of that, but it's not a really not on the developer level. You could use things like Bedrock and from Roots. Roots is the vendor for Sage, which is a theme. They also make some other packages and products that help with the developer experience in WordPress too. And one of those is you can turn your WordPress plugin to a package. So now you can install it and and control the versioning of the plugins and stuff like that. It's a little less, it's easier to set up your DevOps and stuff like that. But yeah, so it's like we kind of need WordPress needs some massaging to be developer friendly. Um, yeah. I'm not sure if I answered the question about Sage, but
I did. I
yeah.
did. So if you would definitely recommend Sage for any developers that got mandated to do a pretty bespoke WordPress theme.
Um,
Not considering the latest version of WordPress, which is another conversation.
well, that's why I'm hesitating here because it has become more complicated to wield uh, any traditional classical theme development in tandem with the new block editor, right? So, yeah, if we ignore the past year of WordPress developments and just put that aside and pretend we don't know about that, yeah,
Right.
definitely like Sage is great and like just standard CMS type stuff with WordPress. And yeah, you can do something really nice and tight for the customer, and that coupled with things like ACF fields, advanced custom fields, and to extend the data the data in the fields that you can accept in WordPress outside of just the editor.
Right.
Um, that's
Okay.
huge.
Right. So before, let's say a year ago and before, it would make the most sense to,
Mhm.
to use Sage as like a framework on top of your WordPress to allow you to have a better
For
developer experience and able to have more organized code and processing features and pushing out features and building out a more robust theme with some more advanced functionality.
for a large site with specific needs, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But in general, the consensus always is to try to keep within the native WordPress environment for
Yeah.
WordPress.
For example, if I were to make, a theme, like a theme for public for publishing, right? For the public WordPress repository, I would not use Sage.
Right. So
I
let's
would
talk
use
about
something
like,
like underscores, which is just like a base layer. So you want to keep it lean, right? That's another thing.
so I quickly wanted you just to talk about like, building out WordPress sites and themes in 2022 with the latest version, block editing in particular, and Gutenberg. It's been somewhat
It's a shit show.
revolutionary. It definitely is. Adoption is going to be a bitch. There's no other way to say it. It's going to be a pretty bad experience for those. I was mentioning that in my last call before that, like, if you're an agency and you're using like a Divi theme, and you want to start using block editing, you can. It's just like you can't migrate your hundreds or thousands of sites on Divi onto block editing. It's not that straightforward.
No, and it's kind of like both platforms or sub platforms call it like Elementor and Divi. It's like they really made their own way of doing things in WordPress. I understand why, but it's not a route I would have taken because again, it's like now you're your own platform and you're using WordPress. So instead
Right.
of leveraging the platform and just leveraging the fact that it has all this documentation and people know how to use it and all that, well now you have to make all your own documentation. Like there's a lot of docs to go through to do stuff in Divi and Elementor, and
Right.
do have like a neat kind of build it yourself interface that's probably easier for end users, but they've gone and built really a separate platform on top of WordPress. And so they need
Right.
to maintain that separate platform now. And
Right.
now WordPress has its own solution to that. So what's going to happen? They're
Right. So
probably
it's
going to have to ditch it all together and like either rework it themselves or just really try to compete. But at one point, why are you competing with the platform you're on? It's a
right.
little counterintuitive.
Right,
Yeah.
for sure. That's going to be an interesting next few years, I find, for those big guys. But getting back
Yeah.
onto block editing, what are the biggest changes between building out sites now with the new framework and compared to 3 years ago?
Um,
Like holistically, what are the biggest differences?
it is no longer a CMS. That's how I've conceptualized it. WordPress for especially coming from a developer's perspective, and this is like the big epiphany I've had over the last like year of trying to like wrangle with WordPress and the block editor a bit. We've used it, okay, WordPress was started as a blog, obviously, right? And then it just because it was such a generically built blog, it was able to handle like a lot with custom post types and stuff like that. It could handle a lot of different data models, and so it became a natural choice for a CMS. Great, cool. And for the longest time, you used it as a CMS, right? You have fields, you add your data in, keyword, you're adding your data in, and then the theme would take care of displaying that, right? That is a CMS. It's not the case now. With the block editor, it is a build it, author it yourself type of interface where the user is given control to move things around. And sorry, Jules, I gotta take this call. It's important.
Okay, no problem. I'll You are on mute or your audio is not enabled.
Better?
Yeah, gotcha.
There we
Okay,
go.
so we're back. So I just want to finish off the conversation with like just wrapping up like block editing
Yes.
and the current new way of building out WordPress sites
Right.
and like the
So,
dramatic holistic differences between now and like 3 years ago. And let's
right.
just not bring up the fact that everyone is still using the old way.
Yeah, exactly. It will come because WordPress has dove headfirst into this. There's no going back, right? So it will be a totally block editing experience at one point in time. When? We'll see. That's going to depend on the user adoption, stuff like that. People are kind of like fighting with it, especially when most of the demographic is using Divi and Elementor and things that are counter to the actual block editor. But just to finish my thought from before is like, yes, before as a developer working with WordPress, it was a CMS. It wasn't the greatest CMS, but it was a CMS, and you can deal with that, especially with ACF and stuff like that. You can really get it to fit your needs in terms of like collecting whatever data you need from the user and then displaying it through a theme, right? And then Sage helped with that and all that. It was great. But now with the editor, it's let's put let's put the display and all the control and everything in the end user's hand, and that's dangerous if we don't know what direction we're taking there, right? Because if you're going to try and use that as a CMS, it's a bad time because you can't control for how a user is going to put things together. Because now you're tasked with the actual design of your page, right? You have control over moving things around and changing all sorts of settings. It's no longer, it used to be as a CMS, you just kind of use WordPress as the data layer, the database and the data, and then the theme, well, you kept all the display in there and you try not to give too much control to the user because users will break things if there's too much control. Now you have infinite control in the editor.
I just want to like touch upon that topic of like your categorization of WordPress now. So you said it started as a blog, evolved into a CMS, still on somewhat of a blogging engine, but it's been
Yeah,
used as a CMS, and it's been now it's the number one CMS tool in the world
by far.
online. But now you're saying it's no longer a CMS. So what's that new title? It would be called a web builder, a
Yeah,
website
it's
builder.
build it yourself kind of website platform, right? So it's in direct competition now with things like Wix and Squarespace and
Webflow and
Duda or Webflow, yeah,
right.
where the end user is building you're building your interface in the back end. You're not, and you're coding a lot less, and so you're using pre-built modules and tools to do the job. But now it's not the responsibility is not just taking in your user input in like a more raw format. No, you're building the whole goddamn thing through the back end of WordPress.
Okay.
And so it's a very radical shift um, from how we used to do things as a developer. For the end user, the user that's been using WordPress not as a developer but just as a site builder or whatever, it's actually probably great in a smooth transition, right? Because before they had a WYSIWYG, and they could only bold text and maybe float some things and put some images in, and now they can do all sorts of things in the editor, and they can even do it with some full site editing. They can do that same thing to their header and their footer, and they have full control. It's great. But as a developer trying to make a finished, polished, handcrafted product, it is for a customer who is
Right.
not the end, who will be the end user, but it shouldn't be making these changes and design changes. It's a recipe for disaster.
Right. So
We've had some projects where still built on Sage, but I've really leveraged the editor, so we have tons of like kind of custom components in the editor for the user to use. And this is like pretty one of our later themes built within the last year, and it works. It's so easy for the customer to break the site,
right.
and there's really no way around it.
Right.
And
Right.
so you can't give them that much control on a large site like that.
So if I had to compare, some of the conceptual methods to theming prior to block editing, you have you set up a theme, a new theme, you name it whatever you want, or you can buy a theme. But let's say you're creating your own theme, you're basing it
Sure.
off a boilerplate, or you're doing custom from scratch, or you're just duplicating the default theme and renaming it something as you wish,
Mm-hmm.
whatever your method is. And then you create like page templates.
Mm-hmm.
And these page templates are specific to the design, let's say, of that web page, or whatever reasons why you need
Well,
specific.
they'll be built into the theme. They'll already be there. Are you talking from the user's standpoint or from the
No, from a
developers?
developer experience.
Okay.
So you're building out page templates, and then that way, you can choose that page template on a specific post type, like a page, and then based on that page template, you might have either some custom fields via
Yeah, some
ACF,
extra features and stuff. Yeah.
extra features, or like different areas to put your content. Those areas in the content using the default WYSIWYG editor still will then just enter into those specific sections on the page template when it renders on the website, right?
Yeah, except I would replace the whole WYSIWYG thing with ACF. Like if you were a developer building themes like that for the last few years, you're probably using some sort of custom field tool. You can do it yourself too through WordPress. WordPress obviously has custom fields baked in, but the backend controls aren't super nice for it. So that's why I use something like ACF. I want
Right.
a date control. I want a upload an image here or whatever. So it was really ACF and like similar type of plugins for custom fields that really made WordPress into a proper CMS,
Right.
because we were able to ditch the main page editor and leave that only for blog posts and the main page content. But then on your page templates, like you were saying, we were able to put all sorts of really intricately placed fields that were added on the back end through a tightly validated data control, right? I'm going to add this date, and it's specifically formatted as a date. So then when I get it into my
Right.
template, I can display it how I want.
So basically, it's more or less kind of just like a really big form that you fill out, and that form has designated areas in a template page where it will display. And you might have some logic on your template page that will take those fields, maybe do something with it, maybe change the formatting or change the styling or whatever you want to do with your logic type of thing.
It was a
More or
form,
less.
and that coupled with the concept of custom post types in WordPress, which was your your collections of things, right? Collections of custom models,
Right.
meaning, a post type would be a page or a post, or in a more generic sense, when you start customizing for a client, projects or employees, or write some sort of generic data model so you can like easily add like a list of them and then dynamically display it in the site.
Right.
That sort of collection of models is a standard feature of any CMS, right?
Right.
And
So
that's why
now
we're using
we're
CMS, because its post model was able to do that because it was flexible.
so right now we're walking into the space of no longer you know data entry as a CMS. Now we're walking into a space where it's more, here's an empty canvas, but here are, elements, components, it's blocks. Obviously it's called blocks, but I'm just trying to find different
Sure.
synonyms that could be relatable from different web
UI
builder
elements.
platforms, other UI
Yeah.
elements, where, hey, I want to add a slider here, add a slider. I want to add a heading here, here's a heading. And it's more like a drag and drop scenario. So more or less is giving a WordPress user the experience of installing and using Elementor or Divi, except natively within WordPress.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, off the bat, how many blocks does your WordPress theme come with?
It's a good question. It is growing by the day. WordPress
In,
team's been pretty good with adding more and more.
inherently in the core, when you update your core, you do get more
Oh
blocks.
yeah, well, because the and it used to be because everything's a block in the editor. Everything's a block.
Right,
You add text, a paragraph, it's a paragraph block. You add a list,
right,
that's a list block. But they can obviously get a lot more complex. It's kind of the same thing as like before everything was a post in WordPress, right?
right,
A page was a post, a media thing was a post. It's so flexible. So it's cool that it's flexible, but you have to, you know, you got to make a lot of things with that. So
right.
yeah, I mean, there's like yeah, they're adding more powerful blocks by the day, and it's great. But at the end of the day, you know, uh, there's always going to be demand for more blocks. It's like, how many blocks can you really fit in there without actually resorting to just building something on the code level? You know what I mean? And it's tricky to actually code out a block right now. If you're coming from a WordPress, a tradition more of a traditional WordPress development background, which would be heavy into PHP. Now it's heavy into JavaScript and
So the
build
tech
tools and all
stack's
sorts of
changed.
things.
The tech stack has changed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Matt Mullenweg, like a few years ago, at the state of address for WordPress or whatever, he said very explicitly, like, if you want to move forward in WordPress as a part of the community and developer, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
we're good.
okay. That you need to double down, triple down onto JavaScript. You need to get intimate. I think his words were, you need to get intimately familiar with JavaScript, something like that. And yeah, definitely true.
Well,
Definitely
in,
true.
in general, in the world of programming languages and frameworks, it is kind of like, regardless of your CMS or framework or tool you're choosing, in the bare bones programming languages, it is heading in that proper trend direction where most web apps, most softwares are leaning off of server side programming languages and are kind of leaning toward JavaScript, for example, dramatically, like with
Yeah.
frameworks such as like React or Vue or something along those lines.
I mean,
And there's
it's the only language on the client, the only enforced language for a web browser, right? You can only write JavaScript besides HTML and CSS, which is really just markup. You If you want to write a program in the browser, only JavaScript. There's WebAssembly too that's coming, but that's a different conversation. But it's literally just JavaScript. And so more and more the entire um, web ecosystem is going to be working around that. And like, so it makes sense to even, also, if you're gonna, like, JavaScript's the language to learn. If you're in web, you need to know JavaScript.
right,
And so if you're gonna choose a backend language, you might as well choose Node because it's JavaScript and you'll just get better at JavaScript. And so that'll translate to to the
right,
browser, right? You'll
right,
just be able to write it everywhere really well.
right.
Um, but it doesn't, yeah, on the back end, it doesn't mean it's the best language to choose, but it is required on the front end.
So as a developer, not a new developer in WordPress, but let's say a developer that has, a few years experience, having, built out websites and more standard traditional theming, page template, ACF field type of methodology, and then moving to block editing and they don't know JavaScript, there will be a learning curve on programming language state.
Yes, yes, they
Okay.
will need to know React,
Okay, they'll need to know React. Okay, so with
which is
blocks,
interesting, yeah, because
with
it's
blocks, if you don't have something that you need out of the box from the WordPress core as a block or a UI element or a um, module, a component, whatever you want to call it, in terms of being able to drag something onto your page and editing it and then publishing it quickly,
mhm.
can you make your own custom blocks? Is that possible?
Yeah, you can make your own custom blocks, but you need to be a good programmer. It's not you can't do it as like, oh, I'm passingly familiar with, which was why I want to which is why I think WordPress took off too, because it had a low barrier to entry to like getting into coding. Like if you need to customize something in your theme, it's like, well, you go in there and you add a couple lines or you drop in this piece of code and it's going to do what you want. And but to do a custom block, it's like, no, you have to know how everything's working here. You have to have a build. uh, WordPress luckily provides one pretty good package for building your custom block plugin, but it's a whole setup. It's a whole developer experience, and on top of that, it's not just vanilla JavaScript. You well, no, you can't. Like, it is using React for your editor, so you also now have to know React, which is another framework. Which, by all means, like, it's a great framework to use in the web. It's definitely a good bet on WordPress side, but it's another technology, and it's baked intimately into WordPress at this point,
Yeah.
at least in the back end.
Right. Okay. So um, it's fair to say that, like, with this new block editing, Gutenberg, and new version of WordPress, that, it could be a website builder. It could be natively an Elementor or in a Divi. That's
Was that the end of the question? Yeah.
yeah. So it can be.
It is.
It
It
is.
is. It
Okay.
is now. It's still kind of catching up. It's not fully matured.
Right.
But if you've installed the latest version and your theme is block capable, um, that is what it is.
Right.
Everything is done. The entire 2022 block theme um, was more or less developed directly from the back end of WordPress. It was saved as a theme, right, with like all the patterns that are in it and stuff like that. But it was essentially developed entirely from the back end of WordPress,
Right.
right? So it was built itself. It wasn't even really coded. It was built with the framework. So it's there now. The default theme in WordPress this this year is something that was built from the builder, the framework. It wasn't coded out, right?
So there's no theme development, let's say.
As a minor amount, right?
Right.
Taking the pre-built blocks and saving them as some patterns and a little bit of setup, but
So,
like,
so as the transition is happening from like standard theme development to block editing and full site editing, can somebody from that old mentality just keep trucking forward, saying, you know what, I don't want to learn React, I don't want to learn JavaScript, I'm just going to impose my already learned methods into the new
definitely,
framework? Yeah, you
yeah,
can.
you can, yeah, you can, but I don't think it would be a wise choice. It's a
Why is
ticking
that?
time bomb. It's a ticking time bomb.
What is?
Well, if you want to, you're gonna have to start installing all sorts of plugins to maintain the old, like, editor and stuff like that, like the classic editor, and but you're gonna have less and less themes that stay up to date with that classical. You just won't stay up to date, and the web moves so fast. I think people should, especially developers, should know these days that you got to update your software. And if you don't like the updates you're getting, change your software. But it's not really I don't think it's really a tenable solution to just stop updating or try to do things in an old way, because they're just going to get older faster.
Right.
The web moves exponentially fast. So, if
But
something got
that could
old
be
over,
said regardless of whatever you've chosen as your framework or tool of choice for developing anything, right?
yes, yeah.
Everything does change with time.
Well,
Like
that's why I say it's
you
just not a wise decision, right? Because
right,
WordPress or not, you should be keeping up to date with
right.
whatever your platform is. Keep up to date with it, and if you don't like the updates, change.
It also sounds like this is going to be a much better experience for those who are not developers by trade, who use WordPress significantly, which I'm going to assume majority of WordPress users are not developer friendly, right? So if they can
Yeah,
out of
I
the
don't.
box drag and drop, edit, and publish something that has been customized to their liking without a developer, that seems to be an advantage.
Maybe, maybe. I'm not sure. It remains to be seen.
Because it seems
I
to me
hope
that's
so.
why the success of Elementor and Divi is from inherently that you don't need a developer to do your new landing page for your marketing campaign.
Yeah, yeah, but at the same time, you kind of stop at a very low level once you need to do something more complicated, and then no developer wants to touch those sites, right? They're
That
not
use
maintainable
Elementor.
they're not maintainable as a large site, right?
So
They really
like
are for
using
starter
Elementor.
sites. They really are for like a starting point. Like they're great if you want to make a prototype of a site as a user that doesn't know how to code. Now, and the reason why I'm hesitant to say just yes to this is because two things. One, it just gives a little way too much control for users to build their sites, right? Um, I am a believer that there should be some restrictions in terms of like what you're able to do, because it's easy to break things. And also, number two is just it is a skill to use the editor. With a flexible tool like that can do so much, and I'm not knocking the editor, the block editor, Gutenberg. It's great, and you can do a lot. It's super flexible, but inherently in the fact that it's so flexible, um, and you can do so much with it, it means it takes more of a skill to actually create something with it.
Same could be said
There's more
about
to
other
learn.
web builders. Like every web builder, it will be inherently its own skill set. Like you can't go from like Webflow to Duda and have the same experience or not have a learning curve. I mean, it will be learning curves regardless.
Yeah, but you want to minimize that for your adoption of your platform. And WordPress is so flexible that I can't see it being that simple for most users. That and I could be wrong, like you said, like it could be just as complicated as any other builder, and so it competes well enough. I hope
Right.
that's the case, but I'm highlighting why I think that it may be an issue in the future
Right.
for some people. It's a little too much power to wield for a novice, even if you're not touching code.
Right. I mean, the same argument could be said about WordPress before too. Like
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of bad sites that came out of it. I'm coming from a perspective of like, because I know a quality site. So, when I see something that's being built that's not
I
great,
mean,
it's like,
that's always been kind of like my problem with like web builders is that like they're giving power to people to
yeah,
pretend to be professionals in a space.
well, exactly. And I think that's my gripe, is that it's not even WordPress specific. It's like all web builders. Like
Right.
I think they're great for prototyping, for
Right.
MVP sites,
Right.
for stuff on a budget, but let's not, use them for something enterprise, guys. Come on.
Right.
Like, you want quality at that point. You don't want to mess around with, things that can be built by anybody.
Right.
It's a
Right.
little too, yeah.
Right. So just
And
in
that's the
general,
space WordPress is in now. So
right. But
see
just
what happens.
all right. So to recap on the block editing, tech stacks change for any developers out there thinking to want to build out new sites with the new version of WordPress, full site editing, block editing, Gutenberg, all that. Tech stacks change. You got to learn JavaScript and React. Um, but there's some positive to it. They're trying to compete in that space of, let's call it, the DIY web builders, where it's more GUI related and can most times end at the GUI. aspect of things. You don't have to go in the code and edit unless you want to do, custom blocks that don't exist.
Hmm.
Um,
Pretty much.
but it could be a good thing. It could be a good thing. And I think it's a smart move, not only just on the changing the tech stack to be up to date, but giving, empowering users that are not devs. And that's kind of the concept of software. Is like you're empowering people to have some type of, you know, um, programming power without being a programmer.
It's
So
yeah, totally. It's the whole who's it, Uncle Ben,
uh,
With great
absolutely.
power comes great responsibility. So let's hope
Yeah, I
everyone's
feel it.
responsible with the websites they build.
Yeah,
And
for sure. But like, I think some people users out there deserve some credit. Like there's people out there who take Elementor seriously and they
yep.
do all their training with
Oh,
Elementor and they
it's a
follow their
market.
resources and it's a
Yeah.
huge market because they make a career out of it. So it's
Hmm.
worthwhile to be a professional within a certain, skill set
Yes.
in
But that's
WordPress.
what I want to call it, right? It's like going back to that's why I'm a little biased, right? Because I am a developer. So I'm not a Gutenberg professional or an Elementor professional. I'm a developer that either builds these tools or builds like, a good final nice polished website, right? With whatever the customer wants. Doesn't matter if it's not available, whatever they want, they get, right? So I'm coming from a bit of a different perspective on a bit of a uh, you know more advanced servicing type of mentality.
Right.
But if it's if you have somebody that needs to get something done in an editor and you need some help with it, by all means, that's a professional space, and there's plenty of work there. Um, but it's yeah, now it's a transitionary space in WordPress, so it's gonna be interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm looking forward to our projects in that field as well because
Totally.
I believe that WordPress users, professional WordPress users in general, is its own skill set, and I think a
Mhm.
lot of them will adapt to it because I think they believe in WordPress and they like it. And proofs in the
Definitely.
pudding. You look at the numbers out there, and they're still number one, and not by a little bit. They didn't just inch. They didn't win by nose. They've lapped people several times over, and
Yeah. And
I
I will say too, the performance of using your block editor is like staggeringly good.
better than Elementor.
Yeah, I haven't done any testing on Elementor recently, but last time I checked, it was pretty poor. Usually,
Di-
it's just there's just way too much going on, way too much included uh, libraries and packages and stuff like
So
that.
that's a
That's
huge
why.
advantage. That is an advantage of adopting this new way of building out sites. Is one is you get to have a GUI experience, and the
Mhm.
second part is you don't have to sacrifice performance.
No, not that I can tell so far. It will
That's
depend on
huge.
at least if you're using the native blocks. If you start using third-party blocks, that may be irresponsible with how they load assets on the page and stuff like that. It's a different
Right.
story. But native blocks, no, it's very performant.
Great. Okay. And last off in conclusion too is any web agencies out there listening in, like try to like zero in on a niche and focus on it, not just on your tech stack but your marketing and sales.
Mhm.
Piggyback off a framework programming language, a CMS, a web builder, and just stick to it and let
Go
people know
all in.
that's what you do. Yeah, go all in. Yeah, for sure. Okay, great. Well,
Cool. Pleasure,
Greg,
Jules.
pleasure's mine. We'll see each other soon.
Cool, bro. See ya.
Take care, bud. Bye.